Politicians who publicly advocate for positions that are contrary to the teachings of their church should refrain from taking the Eucharist.
The Eucharist is supposed to be about communion and fellowship, but we need boundaries.
The American Religious Town Hall meeting is now in session.
Welcome, friends, to the American Religious Town Hall meeting, where the discussion of religious, political, and social issues is meant to promote the cause of religious freedom and to help us better understand each other. And now, here's your host and moderator, Pastor Jerry Lutz.
Hello, I am Andrea Luxton, filling in for Jerry Lutz, and thank you for joining us on our program today. We have an outstanding panel of clergy helping us unravel today's topic, and I would like them to introduce themselves, starting here with Bishop Olson.
My name is Bishop Michael Olson, and I serve as the Roman Catholic Bishop of the Diocese of Fort Worth.
My name is Canon John Peterson. I am an Episcopal priest, and I'm canonically resident in the Diocese of Washington, D.C.
My name is Mel ROBECK. I'm Senior Professor of Church History and Ecumenics and Special Assistant to the President for Ecumenical Relations at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California. I'm also an ordained minister with the Assemblies of God.
Hi, I'm Tony Matthews, and I'm the Senior Pastor at North Garland Baptist Fellowship in Garland, Texas.
Our topic today is one that is potentially controversial and raises a number of different issues, and I know that you are going to enjoy it. In the Church, receiving the Eucharist is the privilege reserved for the faithful. It is believed to be both a symbol and a source of unity with Christ and the Church's members. The question of who constitutes the faithful has risen on more than one occasion. The Church teaches that to perform or to assist directly in the performance of an abortion is a grave sin against the commandment that prohibits murder. Yet politicians advocate for abortion rights. For them to self-identify as faithful Christians and yet to advocate publicly for abortion rights strongly suggests a contradiction of understanding. So since the Eucharist is an important sacrament intended to symbolize the unity of the faithful, should they continue to receive the Eucharist? We would ask our panelists to consider this dilemma, and as they do so, to consider and respond to the following questions. Number one, should politicians who publicly advocate ideas that run directly counter to church teaching on matters of faith and morals be counted as faithful? Should politicians who publicly advocate ideas that run directly counter to church teaching be prohibited from partaking of the Eucharist? And finally, if you were a church leader and had such a person who was a member of your church, how would you counsel that person who publicly advocates ideas that run directly counter to your church's teachings? So those are our questions, and we will start with the two who introduced the topic. Bishop Olson.
Thank you. In a certain sense, I think the catalyst for this issue and for this program on this issue involves the relationship with two prominent Catholics, particularly in public life and in political life, and that would be the President of the United States, Joseph Biden, and then also the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, though they're not exclusive to this. The catalyst as well involved a political kerfuffle that drew the United States Catholic bishops into this mess, where the bishops had instituted 3 years ago to prepare a document on the Eucharist doctrinally, not only with what the Eucharist brings us, how we celebrate it, how you preach in the context of it, what's its effect for the nature of the Church, and then also what are the coherent public expectations for every Catholic who receives the Eucharist. It was that last part then which served as a catalyst when the president of the Bishops' Conference wrote a letter to President Biden, congratulating him on his election and also identifying his position really as a Catholic president, and also that we work to dialogue with them and hope so on all of these issues, recognizing there are some things at which we are at odds. Well, there are 4 dimensions I want to draw this into the issue. First of all, there's the issue of what the Church understands to be mortal sin and why it prevents someone from going to the Eucharist, how the Eucharist is not really designed for the rule of mortal sin, but that is really the direction for the sacrament of penance. There is an incoherence when one consciously in the state of mortal sin and the gravity of it, in a sense, presents himself for Eucharist or herself, because it's like saying, I'm actively resisting the charity the Eucharist brings, and yet I'm grabbing this, something to be grabbed at. Finally, there's the issue of what's known as profanation of the Eucharist, which is to publicly do so, causing scandal, where one's sins are a matter of publicity and the advocacy of a sinful life. Now, the Eucharist is not a sacrament for the perfect. All right, that is not the issue. The challenge particularly is that we're at a state where people in public life misrepresent the Church's teaching by saying that I'm in perfect harmony with God and with my Church, when in fact they're not. They've moved even beyond a state where they're saying, I'm dissenting from this. They're saying, no, this is consonant with authentic Church teaching, and it's consonant with the authentic Church because of aberrant practices that have been habituated over the years. That's the issue of scandal that's particularly of concern for the bishops, because we're ordained and entrusted with the mission to teach, to govern, and sanctify. Particularly challenging is when the president invokes his Catholic faith, as being the foundation for his support for abortion rights as part of health care. When he does so in a press conference or from the Oval Office with a picture of the Holy Father right behind him, as if he's blessing this position, is contrary to this. Finally, as also in the case of Speaker Pelosi, is her investment in the idea of teaching, false teaching in the Church, which is the responsibility of her bishop in San Francisco as well, and all the bishops. So this has prompted a very good thing among the bishops in the United States that we can discuss, not the development of a national policy, which was never our intention, but in a sense to inform how do we govern and work with our individual dioceses, not only on the issue of abortion rights, but other things that are inherently evil. For example, in the 1960s, Archbishop Cody in New Orleans excommunicated and told 4 people who were white supremacists, publicly advocating for that, not to present themselves to the Eucharist. Rightly so, because this was so gravely sinful, it was aberrant and confusing. And so with that, that's sort of an explanation of where we're going. The foundation, let's see, that the Eucharist not only is a grace, is also a grace that brings with it expectations and obligations of response for every one of us to continue to be nurtured by the Eucharist, nourished by it, and become more freely detached from the power of sin in our lives.
Thank you for so carefully unraveling the issue to us. Mel?
Yeah, that's a very helpful introduction, Bishop Olson. I really appreciate how you've laid that out. And it certainly demonstrates, to a certain extent, the difference between Catholic understanding of Eucharist and various Protestant traditions' understanding of Eucharist. Clearly, we share the same thing, that we believe it demonstrates the relationship we have with God, and it demonstrates something of the relationship we have with the community of faith. And I can go into your church and I will never be allowed to receive communion because we have violated that relationship in terms of the communion of faith. And so therefore, I think it's really important to understand that we do have a very different understanding of communion, whereas we could call that closed communion. And there are many Pentecostals, but Protestants who have closed communion also. It's limited only to their members or their membership. For us in the Pentecostal tradition, it's an open communion. That is, this is God's table or Christ's table, and anybody here is welcome to participate in the Eucharist. That means we're going to have people like a Joe Biden or whatever that can present themselves, and we will serve them. Generally speaking, we will serve them. And that raises a second question, because I think this is really a question about church discipline, and it's a question about accountability within the communion of faith. And I think there needs to be, we need to understand that there are boundaries to the Christian faith. Jesus was fairly clear about that, I think, and certainly the epistles are full of examples of that. Even in the passage that we often read at communion in our churches, from 1 Corinthians 11, there's this little statement there that says, before you do this, examine yourself, lest you eat and drink damnation to yourself. Those are pretty harsh words. Those are words that say, you need to be right before you present yourself. Don't just take this as a willy-nilly thing. You're just going to get a little bit of grape juice or wine or and bread. That's not what this is about. It's not even about hospitality in a sense. The table is open, but we hope and pray that you will take seriously the fact that there are boundaries to this table. And those boundaries are, I would say, like you have put it in a sense, the violation, the production, the possibility of scandal within the congregation because you so violate that congregation's teaching. You have put yourself up above that, and therefore you don't feel like you're accountable to pretty much anybody. It's you and God. And when you get to that point, then you'd better be sure that you're in the right place.
Thank you.
Fascinating conversation. While I agree with both the bishop and Dr. Robeck, in our tradition, communion, we have open communion. If you are a believer, you come to our church, you can partake of Holy Communion. One thing we do, we instruct people. There's a period of instruction. We let them know that this is a memorial meal. We are doing this in remembrance of Jesus Christ. It's a celebration meal. We are here to celebrate his sacrifice on the cross, his life, his death, his burial, his resurrection. So we do this in celebration. We do it in remembrance of the Lord, and we do it as we gather together. The community of faith. And as Dr. Robeck mentioned, one crucial element of the instruction is that it is, in addition to being a memorial meal and a celebration meal, it is an examination meal. And we spend time instructing the participants to examine yourself before you take of the bread and the juice, because you do not want to partake of the Lord's Supper if you are out of the will of God. And we do this often because we know that as humans and as Christians, we sin, we make mistakes, and that's why I like having communion, because it gives us a time to come clean before the Lord. So our folks know that this is a serious thing that we do. And when it comes to the politicians, I agree that this, it is scandalous. It is, it's divisive. I think it's a huge problem for our Catholic bishops. How do you? It's confused. It can be confusing to people as well. So how does one mitigate that? I think the church discipline factor is very important, and the accountability. And I'll say more later on. If you were a church leader and had such a person who was a member of your church, if the president and the speaker were members at our church, how would we handle that? And I'll let Ken and John tell us.
Well, I can only speak from the perspective of an Episcopalian. And while we certainly share many common roots with our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters, and I also want to say my enormous respect for Michael. We've been friends for years. At the same time, we do have a different understanding of the Eucharist. And some of those were actually pointed out by Mel. I think that Mel certainly but I don't suspect that Anglicans or Episcopalians would be so casuistic in how they understand this. And I think that we perhaps understand law in a much more broad, general way, and or as it's talked about in the scripture, apodiptic. It is not a casuistry that you're going to pound someone with, but it is an apodiptic way of what does this mean? How do we deal with this today in our cultural situation which we are facing? This, by the way, would be a very interesting program for the American Religious Hall, just to be able to think in these two different ways in which the scripture has always worked with the law, but that is not for this day's topic. I feel for Michael because he is walking a very tight rope. There's no question about that. The Catholic Conference of Bishops, or the Conference of Catholic Bishops in the United States, certainly is not of one mind in this, and as certainly has been reported quite widely in the press. And the fact is that the Archbishop of Washington, Cardinal Gregory, has said that he would not deny communion to the president, one of the cardinals in the House of Bishops. So there's certainly a difference of opinion, or exactly how this opinion might be implemented within the church. I think one of the issues here is implementation. I must read David Gibson, who is director of the Center on Religion and Culture at the Catholic University of Fordham, said this, and I think that this might bring a little bit of help to our discussion. It is striking that you have a president of the United States, an old-time Catholic from Scranton, Pennsylvania, more in line with the Pope than with American bishops. And what he's saying here is that the Pope, of course, has been most gracious to the new president when he was inaugurated, and sent a very warm letter and urged the president to be guided by a concern for building a society marked with authentic justice and freedom, with a particular concern for the poor, the vulnerable, and those who have no voice. And so we have here, not one set of opinions, but we have a diversity of understandings of how to implement this very difficult position that the church has held, and as Mel said, with great respect and integrity for many, many years. And why not? So what is the Eucharist? From my position and my understanding of the Eucharist as an Episcopalian coming out of the Anglican Communion, the Eucharist belongs to Christ. And as ministers of the sacrament, we are just stewards at God's table. We are not owners of the Eucharist. It is Christ who is the owner. And Christ welcomes all of us, I would argue, to God's table. To Christ's table.
So before we take a break, anyone want to take up that question? What would you do? Or go another direction?
I think I just think I would argue with David Gibson on this, frankly, because I don't think we're that far from the Holy Father on this, because especially in the statement that you cite from him, is that, as he's also said, the fundamental right, there's no justice without the right to life. All of the other rights are a condition of that. Church has taught this for 2,000 years. In the earliest experience of the church in the first century, the three sins that put somebody outside of the church and required public penance were adultery, murder, and apostasy, sins against really hope, charity, and faith. I think we don't want to make this an issue with President Biden, and I don't think we've weaponized the Eucharist. He's weaponized his politics against the faith. I mean, he's the one citing his faith, citing his Catholic identity, which is a cultural identity, not a doctrinal one on this issue.
Great. Well, that'll have to be it for the moment. We will take a break. We'll be back with you soon.
We hope you are enjoying today's program. If you would like to learn more about the American Religious Town Hall, please visit our website at americanreligious.org. That's americanreligious.org. There you can read about the mission and history of the program, learn about the Town Hall estates, and view past programs by clicking the appropriate menu buttons. Each week, Pastor Lutz looks forward to receiving your letters. You may write to him at the address shown on your screen. Send your letters to Pastor Jerry Lutz, American Religious Town Hall Meeting, P.O. Box 180118, Dallas, Texas 75218. That's Pastor Jerry Lutz, American Religious Town Hall Meeting, P.O. Box 180118, Dallas, Texas 75218. Thank you for writing, and thank you for watching. And now, back to you and today's closing statements.
Welcome back, everybody. Fascinating conversation. We've seen multiple different views of what the Eucharist really might be. And then there's intriguing questions about where does the church step in to make decisions, or when should the individual be expected to make the decision, and what are the boundaries that we can expect or should expect of church members. So let's hear the summations.
Sure. The Catholic perspective, I think, on this issue can be perhaps enlightened or presented in light of a passage that Professor Reverend Robeck mentioned from 1 Corinthians chapter 11. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the death of the Lord until he comes. Therefore, whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord unworthily will have to answer for the body and blood of the Lord. A person should examine himself, and so eat the bread and drink the cup. The examination that's required of every Catholic approaching the Eucharist really is to be conscious of grave sin, to seek penance and reconciliation for it so as to be returned to the table, to be coherently receiving the grace that the Lord generously offers us through the Eucharist that makes us one with Him and with each other as the body of Christ, the Church. The primary responsibility for approaching the Eucharist is on the part of each communicant. When the responsibility is transferred over as well to the local bishop, particularly it is to prevent scandal, one which is in the Greek means confusion, obscurity, to make the gospel somehow obscure or confusing. And so it's the responsibility of the bishop to talk with the public, profaner, if you will, and then also to understand, why are you doing this? And what do you not understand, or am I missing something? And that takes time, it takes dialogue, and it takes really dialogue in a pastoral setting, which never includes the media or social media.
Thank you. Mel.
Yes, I like very much the way you have stated that. And if I think seriously about the church and the Eucharist in particular, Christ is present at that Eucharist. Whether you consider it a memorial or whether you consider it something more than that, we have different ways of describing what presence means. But Christ is present there. That means that we are face to face with Him in a sense whenever we present ourselves to the table. The second thing I think is it's really important to remember that churches do have not only the right but the obligation to hold people accountable. You know, there's a lot of truth out there. A lot of claims to truth out there that are culturally conditioned but are not morally correct or are not biblically centered or anything like that. So I think we have to be careful and recognize the church has the right to discipline. Now, whether the Eucharist is the best place to do that, I don't think that's the case. I think that should be done behind the scenes, and people should be expected to obey. When that discipline has taken place, or when that accountability has been put before anyone, then I think we have a different kind of an issue. But I think we really need to be careful about how we do this. But discipline, I think, really is an important part of what it means to be Christian.
Fascinating topic. I think one thing we could elaborate on maybe at a later show is the whole ideal of abortion. What is it? I heard the bishop mention earlier about is this murder, or is it something else? I think we need to really drill down on that. And I wish our politicians who are up there making laws, and one side will talk about the right to life after birth. They're all the focus on the programs. There's also the right to life before birth, and I think we need to respect both.
I would just like to say I understand the issues of discipline, okay? But I don't want the people who are listening to this program this morning feel, I'm perhaps not worthy to go to church today. All the fear that I've just heard, I don't want. Instead, the Eucharist does not belong to an exclusive church or club. It belongs to all the people of God. I want to say, we're not called to keep people out. If anything, the gospel calls us to move into the opposite direction. It calls us to break down barriers that keep people being fed. Come just as you are. Receive the gift of bread and wine. This is my body. This is my blood, given for you. Do this in remembrance of me.
Thank you all very much. And now the Charter of the American Religious Town Hall provides that Roman Catholics, Protestant, Jews, educators, and others may appear on this program and can declare their beliefs without hesitancy. And the rest of the members of the panel will uphold and guarantee that American right to all who will appear, irrespective of race or creed, so that the rest of the world can see that here in America, we believe in civil and religious freedom, not only in theory, but in reality. And now, friends, until next week, at the same time and over the very same channel, the American Religious Town Hall meeting stands adjourned. And may the God of all of us bless all of you.